Hello, this is Steve Coughlin of Unconstrained Analytics. I am about to give you a brief on how Marxism really works from the perspective of a political warfare regime. And of course, if you go back, you will see that Unconstrained Analytics has made the case beginning in 2016 that the only way to understand the left is through a political warfare regime, to the exclusion of all other understandings, I would say. So with that, what I'm going to do is open my screen up, and I'm going to take you to our webpage to give you a brief history of what we've been saying, so you can get a sense that we're not just coming to this. So we see right here to the middle right, defeating the Islamic movement inside the United States, and that is this paper right here. Okay, and we put that out in 2016 to show that the Islamic movement in the United States, the dominant player is the Muslim Brotherhood, CARE, and those related groups, that they were engaged, they had adopted political warfare, which is the Maoist insurgency model, as the dominant tactic to use in a united front effort with the neo-Marxist left. We put it in writing. This is the first time that you could read that we said, look, Black Lives Matter, which is a Marxist organization, is actually aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood. And of course, it documents that. There's no warning about this alliance between the left and the Islamic movement. Going back to 2006, I believe, my briefings quoted out the famous quote from Carlos de Jackal that the only way to defeat the United States is an alliance between the Islamic movement, radical Islamic movements, and Marxism. So we have that. Then the baseline document came out in the winter of 2016, and that was Re-Remembering the Misremembered Left. And Re-Remembering the Misremembered Left explained political warfare in terms of Marxism and did a deep dive. This really broke down into two parts, by the way. The first part was a discussion of how Marxism works and where it comes from, and how it is really important to understand the archetype form from which Marxism draws itself from. In many respects, this understanding of Marxism is a visualization. And this briefing today is going to be really an update of part one of Re-Remembering the Misremembered Left to capture what we're saying and bring it current through a visualization. Now, part two is about to be done. We're about to release part two, and that's going to be, part two was really about giving an estimate of the situation. That's an intelligence product, an estimate of the situation from 2019, showing where we've come to since then, and showing that everything we said when we were warning of what to watch for when we put that document out in January 2019 has in fact happened, and it in fact has happened the way we said it would. As part of that effort, in last November 2019, Warning on Racism was put out. And in that warning, just let me read the introduction. There are indicators that the left will initiate a strategic information effort leveraging the full range of political warfare activities to delegitimize the United States. The effort will pivot off the upcoming election cycle and include intimidation and violence. I'm telling you, we predicted this event perfectly. And it's going along the lines we predicted, just as we said. So this briefing is an update of part one of Re-Remembering the Misremembered Left. The updated intelligence estimate of the situation, will be an update and show where do we go from here, putting you on warning that we're riding on all cylinders up to this point. In fact, we on our blog, I would just like to point out, going down to the bottom of the blog, that we put out a document called Narrative Dominance in COVID-19 Warning, that the narratives used to enforce the COVID-19 epidemic were severable from the epidemic itself, that they showed very clear, there were clear warnings of there being a Marxist mass line nature to them, not the least of which is that a US-based social media was censoring Americans and declaring that the authority they were relying on was an international institution, the WHO, which is itself run by Marxists, and that had to be taken seriously. To be clear, we're not challenging the fact that COVID is an epidemic. We're pointing out that the narrative to enforce it is severable from that, and it has done a lot more than enforce any narrative. In parallel with that last April, we also put out a call for a red team on COVID-19, expressing just those same types of warning in a different way. Moving up, what has become very clear, because political warfare is difficult, understanding how Marxism actually works, not this cartoon stuff, and not the stuff, we'll catch some flack for this, not how it's taught at universities, how Marxism really works. And the fact that there is the ideological component, there's the driver, the belief, the view, and then there's the architecture to build it. That it's actually very simple, and it lends itself, the way it operates, it lends itself, it's completely narrative driven. It lends itself more than most people might realize, political warfare, to an analogy to the matrix metaphor of the red pill, blue pill. In fact, as a crossover, we put out these articles in April, I believe, a three-part thing on the matrix and the red pill, blue pill reality, which I would ask people to look at because we lean on that. As the tragic death of Mr. Floyd in Minneapolis was going on, I had put out a document called Requiem for Minnesota. When does a state become a counter state? Warning that events that we have subsequently happened were going to start in Minnesota. And we have a whole series of other things that you could take a review on. I don't want to spend too much time. The focus, however, is on the fact with when does the state become a counter state, is from the 2016 paper, Defeating the Islamic Movement Inside the United States, where we first laid down that political warfare was the engine of what was going to happen, and that the Islamic movement in the United States, its organizations like CARE, were buying into that United Front operation with the left, to remembering in January 2019, to warning on racism, all the way to Requiem on Minnesota. We have been calling out what you're seeing in ways that explain what you're seeing, and we're doing it ahead of the events that you're seeing. So I would like to point out that we're pretty much unparalleled in that context. So what I'd like to do is, let's see. I'm going to switch off the stop share, and we're going to move to a screen share, where what I'll do is point out that this is the brief and the name of the brief. It's called the Dialogue Praxis Process. And in this dialogue praxis process, what I'm going to argue is when Marxism, through the Maoist insurgency model, and actually from the original Marx, that the preferred method of unrolling their tactics is through dialogues in a period of praxis. And that is the baseline on which to understand events. So this is a large brief, and I'm just going to point out here, going to the introduction, that what we're going to cover today is the introduction, and then skip all the way down to part 6, the insurgency pyramid overlay, the narrative build, and the dialogue praxis process. And then part 6, our key example, intersectionality. Intersectionality is just an execution version of the higher level critical race theory, which is itself simply an attack vector on critical theory itself, which is pure Marxism. And it's important to understand, it doesn't borrow from Marxism. It isn't a concept that has affinities with it. It is pure Marxism. So with that, what I'd like to point out is the insurgency pyramid overlay will start, is toward the end of this briefing. In fact, it starts on slide 161. And we're going to pass over a series of things. The Wizard's Grimoire, and what you really need to know about Aufheben, is something that was well known by Marxists early on, including Marx himself. And we will go to these briefings later on to show you how it's built. It is really important to understand that these first 4 parts, and I'll say part 2, part 3, part 4, because we're going to do the parts 1 through 4 are very important. if you don't understand these aspects of Marxism, and some of them are the precursors or the archetype form that Marxism draws from, you can never be on the A team, because this is how they roll, and it'll be made clear that they say so. And it's that aspect that gives you the ability to understand where they're going before they go there. And you need to understand that. So we're going to skip past that and go right to the insurgency pyramid, because we want to be able to show that from this type of analysis, we're able to show that the insurgency we're seeing on the actions we're seeing on the street in cities like Minneapolis, Portland, Seattle, and of course, New York City and other cities, but they're the iconic, small, nice mid-America cities that people are using language for that discounts that they're an insurgency, lines up with what we're talking about when we go into this discussion. So with that, we're going to start with the main brief here, and we're going to start and go through the slides on the introduction to kind of whet your appetite and hold out that we really need to understand these things. So we're just going to give the typical fair use. And what I want to say here is some of the quotes we're going to give, we're going to go through because we want to make a point from them. But there are some quotes we're going to give that we're really just going to make the point on the top line. And we'll let it sit for about 5 seconds, but you can stop and read them, because the point we'll be making when we're making our point is that we're arguing that this is pure Marxism, this is pure Leninism, this is pure Maoism, and this is pure Frankfurt School a la Marcuse or a man named Lukács, and that we're right, this is correct. And the other things are really what we'll call jujitsu. And you'll understand that if we use the word jujitsu, we're basically saying you're in the narrative of the left. So here again, we see the table of contents. And I like to start off with this quote, and I use it, this first series of quotes we're going to use, I like to use almost every time we do something. This is a quote from Joseph Piper, and you can take a moment and read it. And what I'm going to do, and this is going to be in military language, the bluff, the bottom line up front. This is what these briefings seek to do. And I'm going to read off these slides. The left operates through the control of narrative arcs that drive mass line movements to defined objectives following precise, time-tested, triadic formulas, three-pronged attacks designed to destroy your identity in furtherance of denying your right to exist at individual and group levels. This is done through the careful, enforceable, sustained, and systematic identification of everything you value at the personal, cultural, national, and religious levels, restating those values in hostile negative terms, assigning them negative attributes, and then attacking each of the attributes until the values are destroyed. If these efforts are not precisely understood, they cannot be effectively countered. To effectively defend against these efforts, 1, you must defend what is being attacked. This is non-negotiable, and that means you have to take a moment to figure out what is being attacked. 2, to accomplish this, you must understand the nature of the attack. And this includes defending against their 3-tiered attack. A, defend your right to exist. B, challenge the faux scientific claims. Marxism is built on faux science. And this is a non-negotiable point. And defend the rule of law against any and all acts of arbitrary use of authority. What did the COVID-19 narratives, which are severable from COVID-19 themselves, establish that we warned followed mass line Marxist trends where the authority relied on is the WHO run by a Marxist? That was what was used to install arbitrary government yielding to science, which has yet to instantiate itself on the claims made. So part of this really requires surfacing the issues, surfacing what's really going on. Is the COVID-19 narrative really about COVID-19? Because if it was really about protecting people, why were the most safe people protected the most? And why were some of the bluest states putting COVID patients on elderly units where a whole bunch of people died, such that the only people who really died in large numbers were the only people left unprotected and then made vulnerable? We don't treat this as a side effect of these narratives. We treat them like they are the purpose of the narrative. And you have to identify the actors. Let me go to another bottom line up front. And because we're talking about political warfare, and political warfare is a form of warfare that our national security establishment has erased from our entire education, and the whole world knows it, that we really need to understand that when we are attacked by the left, there are actions we will be using, we will be using a military metaphor. Political warfare declares not a political scientist narrative, because everything they write are narratives. We're not going to go to some professor. We really think that to understand how the left rolls, it's like looking at an NFL playbook, which got a lot of pictures and graphics with the narrative on the bottom explaining what has to happen. In the military, and the military analogy, which is our main analogy, we'll talk about it in terms of small action drills. Here, when you're attacked by the left, there are actions on contact, immediate actions that have to be taken. You're attacked by the left on some racism, sexism, homophobia charge. The first thing you have to do, identify the binary being created. What's a binary? And we'll hit this definition a number of times. Binaries are created for the purpose of pitting a reality against a pseudo-reality, something that is real and real to you, against a pseudo-reality, something that's not real. So the reality can be pitted against a pseudo-reality and negated. Identify the negatively defined pseudo-real attributes and personas to determine what real attributes and classes of people are being targeted. 3, defend the real. 4, attack the pseudo-real, including those entities actually responsible for initiating the attack, both at the close attack and the deep attack. And 5, so important, once you're in their attack, you need to break contact. If you decide you're going to parry with them in their narrative, guess what? You are in their narrative, and that narrative only exists to keep you there for the purpose of destroying you. The very act of being in their narrative means you are being targeted and are being destroyed. This brings up a nice little matrix metaphor. Never, ever, ever defend red pill realities in blue pill pseudo realities. The whole Marxist line of attack depends on you going from your real values and then arguing them in a pseudo real context, a matrix world that doesn't recognize your values to exist at all. So that the only thing your values can do when you defend them in the blue pill world is cause them to be destroyed. So, a couple introductory notes. Political warfare, as we use it here, is the Maoist insurgency model. What isn't it? It isn't an overly raucous, overly loud debate by Republicans against Democrats. We're talking about political warfare, the Maoist insurgency model, a model that many people, and my partner Rich Higgins would argue forcefully, perfected Marx. It just can be difficult to understand. So we use this analogy that I already showed you of the red pill, the matrix metaphor, and we put together that 3-part discussion so that if you're hearing us make a matrix metaphor, it would help you to review those so you understand where we're going with this and where we're not going with this, and to understand that we're very serious. We have some links in there so you can see the scene we're talking about. It's very helpful. Secondly, this brief is a visualization, and I will argue that the Marxist frame of what they're doing has always been a visualization, and that will be for later briefings. This visualization we're using relies on visualizations in the form of graphical presentations of the concepts being explained, borrowing from tactical level battle planning and a deliberate decision-making process. Each of the graphical presentations provided in its doctrinal template form, with each concept visually represented in its own overlay. What am I saying here? If you do a deliberate military decision-making process, you go to a board and you create acetate overlays of a concept. Each person does his own thing. And you take each overlay and you put it over a map or you put it over a scenario and you see what's going to happen. When it's a doctrinal template, it's the perfect picture of what the other side will do if the environment, the woods, the forest, real opposition that might throw bombs here and there against what they're trying to do would do. It's the perfect vision of what they're going to do. And you take all those visual graphical overlays, and all of a sudden when you see the picture of the battle with all these things in there, you will see exactly how the threat will try to attack you. You see where it's highly improbable that they could attack you. You will see that maybe the people you're shooting at 10 feet in front of you are only there to hold you in place while the long-range artillery is blowing you up, and you don't understand there's long-range artillery. So going back to this, as the overlays are stacked up, a picture emerges that shows how seemingly disparate political warfare concepts synchronize into a coherent, interoperable attack. If a picture is worth 1,000 words, it is hoped that the visualization of a political warfare effort will simplify one's understanding of what they see in a manner that provides for the ability to generate timely, accurate, and actionable countermeasures ahead of the attack. Now, here's a book that was written in 1884, quoting a book that I could no longer find it, called Secret Societies in Switzerland, 1840s, and it's in a chapter from 1884 explaining Karl Marx. And I would like to argue that any analysis of Marxism and the left that doesn't account for this definition, all elements of the definition, miss the ability to counter all aspects of the left. Now, you'll see there's references to God and religion. We're not going to get into a religious discussion. We're pointing out that their attack goes there, and you need to account for it. The masses can only be gathered under the flag of negation. It's important. When you present detailed plans, you excite controversies and sow divisions. We shall have deserved well of it if we stir hatred and contempt against all existing institutions. Sound like Antifa? We make war against all prevailing ideas of religion, of the state, of country, of patriotism. The idea of God is the keystone of a perverted civilization. It must be destroyed. The true root of liberty, of equality, of culture is atheism. Nothing must restrain the spontaneity of the human mind. All this work of annihilation could neither be done by reform nor by conspiracy, but by the revolution. But by revolution, a revolution is never made, it makes itself. Well, after intense effort is made to cause it to happen. This is the 1840s. I'm showing it's from the chapter on Karl Marx to show what exactly he was drawing on. And this right here defines 100% of what you're seeing with Antifa and BLM on the street. I would like to point out that if you are backing an organization that has the destruction of God at the center, how can you call yourself, the Archbishop of Washington, when you call for people to join a protest that looks like this? And the answer is, you can't. But if you are doing it, you're engaging in the negation of the very thing you're supposed to protect. And for people whose job it is to be good shepherds, that seems to me that the wolf is the shepherd. So, and finally, here's another slide I'd like to put in as part of our introduction. And I would put this in every other slide of a brief if I could get away with it. It is from Unrestricted Warfare. It was written by two Chinese colonels in the People's Liberation Army War College. And I think this is so important. The whole world knows this is true about our national security apparatus, and they've known it since the 90s. They've known it since the 90s, and it is still true. And it colors everything we're saying about political warfare, because unrestricted warfare is political warfare. And we not only don't do political warfare, we don't even understand what it is. Ready for the quote? 1999, Whether it be the intrusion of hackers, a major explosion at the World Trade Center, a bombing attack by bin Laden, all of these greatly exceed the frequency bandwidths understood by the American military, to which you could say our national security apparatus. This is because they have never taken into consideration and have even refused to consider means that are contrary to tradition and to select measures of operation other than military means. What are they saying? They say, at the very best, all America does in its national security apparatus, and we can include national law enforcement to have counterterror and counterintelligence missions, all they do is bootstrap up from what they see on the street to operations to counter the operations. And if they tie four operational plans together, they call it strategy. What they don't realize is the American national security apparatus has disabled itself in its ability to understand national security, strategic level threats. The Chinese wrote in 1999 that they not only don't understand this, they're not going to get it. We are 21 years past this state, and America is on the precipice of coming down, and it's time we understand that quote is deadly serious. And finally, our last discussion on the introduction before we move to the insurgency itself. This is a quote right out of Lenin's book from 1915. Dialectics is the theory of knowledge of Hegel and Marxism. This is the aspect of the matter. It is not an aspect, but the essence of the matter, to which Plekhanov, not to speak of other Marxists, pay no attention. If you think that you can understand Marxism without understanding the dialectic, you're wrong. If you think that you can defend America without bringing this in, you will be the agent the left needs to use for bringing America down. Because defending America against Marxism without accounting for dialectics makes you a controlled opposition. Everything you will do will fail because as Marx said, it is ground zero. It is the #1 event. And just so people can understand, I didn't put anything out of context, I included that quote. So with that, what we're going to do is we're going to jump ahead to all these, if you see these slides moving, by the way, I want you to see all these things that are explained before we get to slide 161. So we're going to come back and explain all the things you're seeing here that you might have a hard time understanding. And that's fair. I get that. But what we want to show here now is here's what's on the ground now. All this analysis built up to us being able to show this and the fact that intersectionality isn't something that borrows from Marxism. It is pure Marxism. It is the purest form of Marxism. And anything that gets in the way of understanding that will have your minister, priest, or rabbi back to people who will negate you completely. Okay, not just to mention our government leads and stuff like that. So what you see here, it's called the Insurgency Pyramid Overlay, Narrative Build, and Dialogue. And I'll introduce these concepts in very short ways. So I don't want to leave you completely hanging on that. So why am I doing this? Because this is what we're seeing on the street right now, and the analysis that got us to this point would have given you warning. Okay. And the other part of it is, and just let me go back here, is that the insurgency we're seeing on the street completely, and we're calling that an overlay, it completely meshes with the political warfare explanations we're seeing. If the insurgency happens on the street, the political warfare is what's coming on up here to make that happen. And they are tongue and groove. If you see an insurgency that is leftist or fascist, it has a political warfare engine driving it. How do you understand that pyramid here if you are completely blind to the fact that there is the insurgency pyramid here, if you're completely blind to the fact that its command and control is coming from here, and they will interoperate seamlessly. So what you have here is, you've seen this on Twitter, you've seen it on YouTube. This graphic has been making the rounds, the insurgency pyramid. And what I want to do is give you an explanation of it. And I'll explain a couple things as we move along, because there are some things in here that will be difficult. And because this is designed to show you how the insurgency pyramid meshes with political warfare. And what we're using is the Special Operations Research Office Pyramid, the SORO, which comes close to Soros if you think about it, which was recently updated in 2016. And what you can see here, if we take a look quickly at this pyramid, is that here are all the things that you see in the insurgency pyramid. I want you to pay attention where it says shadow governance abilities. There's a dotted line because it's split in two. And underneath it are all the clandestine things that happen before this event happens. And all the things above that line are what you see. And the most important thing I want you to understand when you look at this is the fact that if you're only understanding what you're seeing on the street today comes from everything you see above that line, you need to understand everything that has happened, that we're saying happened, that our political warfare writings going back to remembering and understanding the Islamic movement and warning on racism said was happening. So here we are, we have the insurgency pyramid right next to the political warfare build. And I just want to give you, because we're going to brief this at some future point, how we get there. And remember, this is extremely important. I will argue that the insurgency pyramid depends on what we see to the right. There are two overlays here. One is the dialogue praxis overlay. And the dialogue praxis overlay is the thing that looks like a goalpost. It's really a parentheses with a dashed line. You can see things moving from left to right. And that is a period. What is it, a period? It's a period where each of those little green dots does something. And what does it do? It introduces a dialogue. Now, sometimes dialogue means just to have a conversation, but you should be on notice that dialogue also has a really close link to dialectic. And many times in the political and even religious space, when you hear people say they want to have a dialogue, they want to have a dialectical discussion for the purpose of moving you to the middle, which is moving you away from what you believe to where they want you to go for the purpose of negating what you believe. And of course, they do it in little bites over time. So the number one goal of Marxism is to create a period of praxis in which these little negating events, these little dialogues happen until they go from the world underneath the dotted line, which is how you see the world in reality, and above the waterline into their pseudo-reality. And on top of that is something we're calling the narrative build. And the narrative build, of course, starts underneath the dialogue. It's starting in your real world. And they introduce terms, or they take terms you're already aware of and mean something to you and engage in a 1 year, 2 year, 5 year plan to come up with an alternate meaning to that word, and then change the meaning of the word or introduce new terms. And its goal is to engage in nonviolent activities that will be synced up with the period of praxis to bring the narrative above the dotted line and above the dialectical process of negation. And once they get above that line, they can escalate to nonviolent activity. Let's just say that's activities below the dotted line, the clandestine world, and start to entertain violence in an increasingly escalatory, violent way. So what we're showing here is in the period of praxis, there are narrative builds that are designed to bring people from one position to another position where they can slowly inculcate violence. A key point moving forward here for this discussion on how the insurgency meshes with political warfare is that the violence exists inside the narrative. It always exists inside the narrative. The narrative is the nonviolent main actor that creates space for violence to happen. And that entire narrative is a pseudo-reality, or you could say it is the world of the matrix. So, moving on. Why are we doing this? Because we had violence start up by Antifa and BLM in late May, in which we got commentaries from national leaders that were simply dangerously under-inclusive to a foreseeable and foreseen mass line attack. So what the US Attorney General Barr called peaceful protests being hijacked by violent radical elements can be better explained as escalations in an insurgency campaign in what the Soviets called agitation and propagation, agitatia I provokatia, in phases of an insurgency operation. From his article, I'm going to read it. Unfortunately, with the rioting, what is occurring in many of our cities around the country, the voices of peaceful protests are being hijacked by violent radical elements. Groups of outside radicals and agitators are exploiting the situation to pursue their own separate and violent agenda. In many places, it appears the violence is planned, organized, and driven by an anarchic and left extremist groups. Far left extremist groups using Antifa-like tactics, many of whom have traveled outside the state to promote the violence. Do you see that what he said at the top is in complete conflict with what he's seeing at the bottom half of his own quote? If it's the bottom end of the quote, he needs to prepare himself for the fact that these violent groups created conditions that allowed a non-peaceful group to create status for cover for them to inject themselves with, and that's why they were there to begin with. Political warfare. And I'm actually not blaming Attorney General Barr for this. Our entire national security language has been built around narratives designed to take our eyes off real national security threats. And it's been that way for a long time. The entire war on terror was based on these narratives. The very way we talk about the left and our national security is designed to keep us from ever being able to touch the issue. But remember, he talked about left-wing extremist groups using Antifa-like tactics. We'll get back to this, because why are we bringing up the pyramid right now? Because this is dangerously unaware. And more importantly, we need to recognize that Attorney General Barr is supported by people who may be batting for the other team ideologically. Now, am I saying that everybody in the FBI or DHS are criminals? No, I'm not. I'm saying they're strategically disoriented, just like the Chinese said. So here we have a article that came out, news that came out just this month. White supremacy is the most lethal threat to the DHS, to the US, a DHS draft assessment says. Well, they've been saying this for a very long time. But why does DHS orient, and this is the question that has to be asked, why does DHS orient its counterterror efforts on constructed mass line personas when real Marxist groups like Antifa, BLM, and BLM engage in real street terror in American urban cities right now? This is a strong warning, extremely powerful warning, that our national security law enforcement are oriented on narratives constructed in that narrative build that has them completely delaminated from the events that are happening. This becomes very important because when they say this to an American public who sees with their own eyes what's happening, are they not negating themselves in the eyes of the public? Are they not delegitimizing themselves? People aren't saying, gee, what are they looking at that I'm missing? They're saying, that's just crazy. So I'm putting this in here. We're actually going to get back to this later where it's going to become relevant, but I put it here because it just gives you a bootstrap that we're not joking about the fact that this, do we understand that there are neo-Nazis, KK groups, and white supremacists? There absolutely are. Can they mount a threat on par with Antifa, BLM? Can they have global presence like them? That's just laughable. That's just laughable. And it's wrong. And it shows a complete deferment to ideological views at the expense of actual national security and actual safety of citizens. So going all the way back to the first appearance of those coexist bumper stickers and those hate bumper stickers. Yeah. Positive personal and social attributes were identified and targeted for minimization through the slow evolution of hostile narratives populated by constructed personas designed to invert those positive attributes. As a part of mass line narrative development, mass lines are how political warfare, neo-Marxist political warfare operations execute. Negative personas are used to characterize the opposition in odious and undesirable terms. Obey us or be one of them. Pushed into the persona, when the mass line deploys, when the mass line deploys, gets citizens, creates open violence in the streets that attacks citizens. When the mass line deploys, citizens are put in a binary where they must choose between being menacingly characterized by the persona for defending their values or abandoning those values. While the hostile white supremacy persona is designed to evoke the KKK or neo-Nazi persona and designed to get you to say, if I say something that defends just America, it's designed to get you to say, I'm not one of them. And of course you're not one of them. Hence, it actually targets normal views of self, of America, and healthy notions of patriotism and the Constitution. So when you see DHS make this statement, you should be saying, they're either looking at something that you haven't seen that isn't propaganda coming from, networks, or this is an ideologically oriented domestic national security organization completely oriented on a narrative at the expense of actual violence in the street. Just a couple of days ago, you had the FBI director say Antifa is an ideology, not an organization. Well, that means that Director Wray directly contradicted what AG Barr said when people are using Antifa-like strategies and organizational tactics. Of course, this is crazy. We don't really think of threats in terms of left, right at the FBI. How do you think about threats? Do you have a political scientist design something called violent extremism, where you can cut out all the facts that define what you're seeing, so you can pretend you're getting in this kind of Gnostic-like pseudo-reality where you can scientifically separate the reasons they're violent from why they're violent, and then hire other psychologists and sociologists to then give you, these highly academically rigorous, completely irrelevant models that make you feel good about yourself and intellectually superior to American citizens? This is complete strategic disorientation. He says we don't look at ideology. What about white supremacism? You are backing that. You are backing that. President of the United States had to issue an executive order to say, stop engaging in Marxist propaganda inside the organization of the FBI. So let's return to this model. We see it. We see that the bottom part of if we take the bottom part of that pyramid and line it up with the praxis and narrative build, what we see here is that this part of the insurgency pyramid goes deep into the nonviolent phase and covers everything up to and including the violent phase. That's pretty straightforward. And then we go to the second part, the next part of the pyramid, that part of the pyramid, which starts showing events that go on, low-level things, threats, violent protests that get just incrementally more hostile, more violent over time. And you see that basically starts at the period where the period of praxis has pushed the population above the line, where they have people respond to them in their narrative, which is where they could start introducing elements of violence inside their nonviolent narrative. And that's where we're up to including the point where we get to the shadow governance and activities. And then finally, the violent, which exists solely in the violent frame. And that's what we're seeing today. Okay, so let's take a look at that. Preparation of revolutionary cadres and masses for revolution, and preparation of parallel hierarchies for taking over government positions. That's what's along the side. And I really want to point out to you that by the time they go to the overt operations you see on the street, all this is already in place. This is extremely important because that means that those peaceful protests were being engineered all the way up that pyramid to that point. And maybe it could be true that they brought people out there to peacefully protest. Just like at the Tahrir Square, the main actors always made sure the media interviewed people who were just there to protest corruption. And that became the narrative then, when in fact it was a Muslim Brotherhood operation from the beginning. So look, preparation of parallel hierarchies for taking over government positions. Well, political warfare designates that as the counter state. Popular culture calls it the deep state. Actions in furtherance of the effort are called counter-state operations or insurgency operations. So you see that the insurgency activity, that the insurgency pyramid talks about, that what you see is a perfect match for the counter-state operations of political warfare. And this raises really deep, concerning questions. Okay, I'm going to give you this quote, and I'll just tell you that this is part of the build of the discussion that we'll have to come back later to explain in more detail. And that is, all those initiate-laden scientized terms that make it imponderable for non-initiates to understand. And I actually made sure I wrote a note to cover the space enough for you to move on in the discussion. When we say all the initiate-laden language, it speaks to how the narrative, how narratives drive command and control in a political warfare insurgency model. And these speak to how they drive command and control in the underground phases of the insurgency and political warfare. So the initiate is the person who's a part of the revolutionary activity. The non-initiate is a person who hears peaceful protest and just thinks these people are confused because this has nothing to do with peaceful protest. But you know, maybe for the initiate, they know that peaceful protest sends a message, and a message that was sent out in a mass line narrative where you had complete mass line, the mob which is acting directionally, which means it's not a mob, it's a Maoist mass line movement executing Marxist objectives. It's how you can know that that initiate understood peaceful protest or rioting is the voice of the oppressed in a way that you didn't understand it, in which you got complete command and control compliance across the board, and in which you got our national security and national law enforcement to comply with. Okay, recognizing that increased political violence, terror, and sabotage is the category just below the opening violent phase of insurgent operations, and recognizing that we are witnessing this very activity in Minneapolis, Seattle, and Portland, and of course New York City and other places as well. What is the initiate meaning behind insurgency phrases like rioting is the voice of the oppressed and peaceful protest? Are these mass line command and control communications that, one, permissively signal that violence against citizens and property will be under-inclusively responded to and thus sanctioned? And two, that peaceful protest de facto establishes the insurgency standard that insurgency violence is permitted, resistance to it disfavored, and therefore police intervention unwarranted. What if the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, who called this a peaceful protest, didn't realize that that's what that language actually meant? Let's just say he didn't realize that's what it meant, but he said it. Did he obey the narrative? Because of course, to execute a Marxist movement, it's dependent on 90% of the people never understanding that simply obeying the narrative puts them in their camp. By the way, the Soviets called this in-depth use of the language. Just letting you know that we could write this whole brief on stuff that was written before most people watching it were ever born. We bring this up because let's talk about the concept of omission and commission. When elected politicians and government leaders, local, state, and federal law enforcement, and national security organizations, you know, like the Department of Defense, echo the term in political warfare as playback, the initiate language of the insurgency, that they effectively position themselves as agents of that insurgency. Clear, whether they know it or not. In asking this question, the issue isn't whether they support the insurgency, but whether they know they're supporting the insurgency, even if by omission. I mean, this raises really serious questions, very serious questions. And I think it's at a time where we need to understand things like rebellion and insurrection under the USC, and advocating overthrow of the government, not in terms of whether it's a peaceful protest that we need not sit back, but whether this insurgency pyramid reflects the events we're seeing in a way that instantiates the political warfare model we put out that said it was coming, that also instantiates the insurgency. Whether these terms then come into play. Let's return back to this pyramid. You know, I have the pyramid broken up into the pieces we use there so you can get a visual and move on and take a look at something. If the first time you realize there is a problem is when mayors, you know, Minneapolis, Seattle, Portland, New York City, sanction violent Antifa BLM enforcement of mass line enforcement narratives, look at everything you have missed. This demands a complete reset. And in this reset, you have to challenge the way you have chosen to understand it. If we can prove that the way you have chosen to understand it, even if it's institutionalized in our national security apparatus, is designed to keep you from ever getting to this reality, because it's as real as it gets. Now, we're going to shift now to how this works, we're going to shift now to how this politically correct hate speech narrative transitions to politically correct narrative that transitions to intersectionality that becomes, allows for violence. So diversity transitioning to intersectionality in the binary retreat formula, in the narrative build as it rises above the period of praxis into the pseudo-reality. The pseudo-reality that they've got the population to talk about their real issues. And of course, it's the #1 example of this brief, and it's toward the end of this brief. All the pieces are in place from everything brief that we'll get to. We'll circle around and create those briefings later. Intersectionality, it's pure Hegel, it's pure Marx, it's pure negation, it's pure, the phrase is Aufheben der Kultur, destroy the culture, or it can be translated as cancel the culture or cancel culture. You see the close fit there? Cancel culture, Aufheben der Kultur. Aufheben der Kultur is the tagline for the Frankfurt School. So let's take a look at intersectionality, and let's see where we can find its basis. It says Intersectionality by Patricia Collins, and we have Critical Race Theory by, among other things. I'm just looking here, Kimberly Crenshaw. And these are iconic books on the subject. And the first thing you might take notice of is that it has critical theory in it. That's the first indicator, like a brick hitting you on the head, okay, that intersectionality is Marxism. It's just that simple, okay? Intersectionality is a science of reason construct, and this will be explained later. A science of reason concept is taking a ideology and converting it to a language of science, and then calling it science, and then declaring people who don't agree with it unscientific and stupid. That's what science of reason is. It's pure propaganda. Intersectionality is a science of reason construct that facilitates critical theory, which is Marxism. The critical theory, intersectionality is a science of reason construct that facilitates the critical theory objective of cultural level dialectical negations of a targeted population for the purpose of its destruction. So while we're here, let's just take a look at some things we just saw recently from Kimberly Crenshaw on intersectionality and the fact that the FBI is training this. And yet this is Marxism. It's the ongoing Marxist indoctrination at the FBI that the President of the United States signed an executive order saying he was going to stop. So intersectionality is a science of reason construct. We've already had this quote. We're just getting back to a reset. So critical theory is a neo-Marxist principle that envisions the total dissolution of the existing order through a series of escalating dialectical negations over time. Intersectionality is an application of critical theory principles oriented towards the destruction of national culture. It is consistent with Marx's call for the factual dissolution of the world order through the ruthless criticism of that order. If you see the word critical, criticism, and related terms in anything, that's the first instance that you should put up your radar and make sure you're not going into a Marxist negation. Intersectionality follows the dialogue praxis process, which is something we're going to brief. Remember, a series of dialogue events through a period of praxis that will cause things to collapse.
Just a sec.
Oh, my Apple just answered my intersectionality question. Isn't that interesting? I think I'll turn my iPhone off. I wanted to explain intersectionality to me. Scary. Okay, intersectionality follows a dialogue praxis process of systematic cultural destruction consistent with the Institute of Social Researches, the Frankfurt School's commitment to aufheben der Kultur, destroy the culture, or as Marx would say, the dissolution of the existing order. So I would like to give a brief history of this because people, their eyes glaze over when you bring up the Hegelian nature of Marxism and they want to get into all these arguments about why it is or why it isn't. But all we really have to do is show that these guys were locked in tight with Hegel, and so must you be. Now, of course, we're not going to make you have to learn Hegel. But here in Karl Marx's book, A Contribution to the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy, what does he say? Criticism dealing with this content is criticism in a hand-to-hand fight. And in such a fight, the point is not whether the opponent is a noble, equal, interesting opponent. The point is to strike him. The actual pressure must be made more pressing by adding to it consciousness of pressure. The shame must be made more shameful by publicizing it. Gosh, and you think this came from Alinsky. The people must be taught to be terrified at itself. Does this sound like aufheben der Kultur, destroy the culture? Does it sound familiar? Minneapolis, Seattle, Portland? I could give everything we're doing today, this whole brief based only on what Marx wrote over 25 years before he wrote Das Kapital. Marx's critical philosophy, from which the Frankfurt School created critical theory. By heralding the dissolution of the heretofore existing world order, the proletariat merely proclaims the secret of its own existence, Antifa coming out on the street, for it is the factual dissolution of that world order. Again, this comes from Karl Marx's contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. And then from his letter to a friend, if we have no business with the construction of the future or with the organizing of it for all time, there can still be no doubt about the task confronting us at present, the ruthless criticism of the existing order. Does that sound familiar? The new is old. Aufheben der Kultur becomes cancel culture. But I want you to understand, true Marxist leaders understand something the rabble doesn't. And this is already prepared. This will become so much clearer when we introduce these concepts. And that is, true Marxists know that all Marxism does is destroy. So you will look for it and you'll know who the leaders are because they don't think they're building a perfect future world. They know that all they can do is destroy. That's why you see language like that. That's code. So can you spot the code in here? The dissolution of the heretofore existing world. The proletariat, the original and still controlling definition of the proletariat, are those committed to the dissolution of the heretofore existing world order. Nihilism, we have no business with the construction of the future or with organizing it, means Marx's only intent was to destroy the existing order with no intention of building any future perfect world. How about the fact that dissolution comes from that famous phrase, solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate. And finally, ruthless criticism. Critical philosophy, critical theory, critical historical approach, that's biblical analysis. Anything with critical in it simply signals the ruthless destruction of the object of the criticism. Doesn't it sound like today's proletariat? Again, the new is old again. So I like to call this center mass Marxism. Ultimately, all analysis of Marx doesn't center on this. And at the center of that is his orientation to Hegel, will always miss what Marxism is doing. Marxism is always only about the total destruction of the current order and nothing else. Just go to Venezuela. It's not just that they have failed in building something. The true leaders know that they would rather be subject in heaven. They would rather be rulers of hell than subject in heaven. And in fact, we know that that's what Marx was thinking in the days he wrote his talk about the creation of the proletariat and the ruthless destruction of the world order. As a matter of fact, history over documents that Marxism has established records of those people who would. I wish to avenge myself of the one who rules above, Marx said. Thus heaven I have forfeited, I know it full well. My soul, once true to God, is chosen for hell. He said that in 1837. In 1839, he said, if there is something which devours, I'll leap within it. Though I bring the world to ruins, the world which bulks between me and the abyss, I will smash to pieces with my enduring curses. And of course, we have the famous quote from Saul Alinsky in Rules for Radicals, in which he dedicates his book to Lucifer. Lest we forget at least an over-the-shoulder acknowledgement to the very first radical, from all our legends, mythology, and history, and who is to know where mythology leaves off and history begins, or which is which, the first radical known to man who rebelled against the establishment and did it so effectively that he had his own kingdom, Lucifer. I want to make this so clear. Marxism is defined by the fact that its real leaders would rather be rulers in hell than subjects in heaven. And anybody in the religious community who takes a knee to BLM or to Antifa is bending their knee here. And the fact that they don't have the discernment to know that is their problem, not yours. So, but please notice that with that statement from Alinsky, it serves his purpose of where he's going and what he thinks about, as it is an homage to the original Marxist Marx. I want to do this quick segue here, because really, when does this chronic association transition from being an interesting curiosity? Oh, it's interesting that they had these satanic things. When does it transition? You know, we remember Podesta and talking about spirit cooking and these other weird occult rituals. We have the founder of Black Lives Matter saying, you know, in the same sentence where she says, we are Marxist, we actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia in particular, we are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists. We are super versed on sorts of ideological theories. And yet it comes out that she also is an occultist. And she says so. The thing is, we're not like, you know, speculating on that. And of course, we define the Republican Party establishment as the controlled opposition. And they nominated Aria DeMezzo for sheriff in some New Hampshire town. And of course, her slogan is, F the police. And she says so. And your Republican Party said that that was their designation. So on defeat mechanisms, big tent politics and big tent religion is always only about pairing you up, your political view or your religious view, with its antithetical opposite for negation. Where the big tent enters, the word remnant soon follows. The people who opened the big tent realize that they now become remnants. And of course, you have the ubiquitous F your Jesus BLM rioters saying that. So at what point does this kind of interesting and kind of chuckling curiosity that there's such a historic and continuous relationship between being Marxist and having an affinity for the occult, even if it's just to create the image, that shouldn't make it the legitimate object of real analysis? Let me rephrase it. Is leaving that out of the analysis making your analysis kind of unfactual? And I will argue it is. This is a movie that's on Netflix, if I keep my account. And it was just a psychiatrist who was talking to a detective who was dealing with these people doing occult things in a police investigation. And he had to tell his people, remember what I said, detective. It doesn't matter if it's real. What matters is the power it holds, that there are people who think this. What matters are the consequences it brings because there are people who think this, and that there are those who would die for it and murder for it, just like we're seeing in the streets of America today. So this needs to be looked at. This is Marx version 1.0, the stuff he wrote in 1844, creating his original proletariat, which was dedicated to the ruthless destruction of everything. And that is easily 23 years before Das Kapital. So we're talking about Marx 1.0, and we're talking about the fact that Marx 1.0 is actually pure Marxism. And Das Kapital was just an application that evolved after they did their after actions in the horrific riots of 1848 in Europe. This is the original Marx. It's always been center mask, the archetype form of all Marxist movements. The version of Marx that the Institute for Social Research, the Frankfurt School, implemented and said they were implementing, declaring it the main effort of their Marxist movement all the way back in the 1920s. It's the dominant form of Marxism confronting America today, and at least in the open since the 1960s when Marcuse said so. A pure application of Hegel's Aufheben formula using Marx's original concept of the proletariat. Das Kapital, this was the first major deployment, line of effort of Marx's negation campaign. It remains a powerful line of effort. It, one, attracts the have-nots for street operations, keeps us, the opposition to that, fixated on those street operations. On a blue pill metaphor, us focusing on that aspect of Das Kapital serves as a strategic distraction. It keeps our eyes, we're the opposition to them, focused on a supporting operational application and away from both the strategic design and the main effort. So let's just take some quotes from history to show that we're not making this up and we're not exaggerating. And we're saying this is the part of Marxism that nobody likes to talk about, which is the game. And remember, in the introduction, we quoted Lenin to tell people, it's the game. It isn't an aspect of Marxism. It is the aspect. And of course, Willy Munzenberg was the head of the Comintern in the early 1920s. We must organize the intellectuals and use them to make Western civilization stink. Only then, after they have corrupted it, all its values and made life based, can we impose the dictatorship of the proletariat. What is the proletariat? Those people dedicated to the total destruction of America. This is the man who created the term Aufheben der Kultur, Lukács, a man from Hungary who ran the Hungarian Soviet Socialist Republic in the 1920s for about 6 or 9 months before he was booted. And he is the father of another famous Hungarian Marxist, Soros. How many people don't even know that? This is 1910 and 1915. I saw the revolutionary destruction of society as one of the only solutions to the cultural contradictions of the epoch. And then, all the social forces I have hated since my youth, which I aimed in spirit to annihilate, now came together to unleash the first global war. At the same time, they are globally without any ideas, the very enemies of ideas. Right from the beginning, I was among the negative forces. Aufheben der Kultur. He also said, all to the good, but who will defend us from Western civilization? And finally, I take this quote from his book, The Old Culture and the New Culture, because in the translation, in the book, he basically uses the word Aufheben, Aufheben, Aufheben to explain what he's doing. In the last analysis, the communist social order means the Aufheben of the economy as an end in itself. Remember, all they do is destroy. This is all the more true because this side of the transformation, the Aufheben of the economy, is an end in itself. He's repeating himself, cannot express itself in the surface appearance of life after the seizure of power. It has to be made to be gone. Domination over the economy, that is what the socialist economy is, means the Aufheben of autonomy of the economy with the Aufheben of human isolation and the anarchic individualism, human society, ... I use this quote because when you go to the translator's notes, the translator has to tell you how he's negotiating the language of Hegel and the language of Lukács, which is the language of the Frankfurt School. So how close is Marxism, the Frankfurt School, to Hegel? I just provide a quote here from the translator's notes of Lukács' book on the ontology of social being, Hegel. So he says, well, I'll just let people read it, but all I'm saying is he had to tell the reader how he would translate German terms like Begriff into notion, Aufheben into sublation, and sometimes it creates real confusion, and he apologizes. Why am I putting this here? There is no separation on the ideological driver that the Frankfurt School uses. They borrowed from Hegel, and the Hegel concepts that drive it. So from our book, Re-Remembering the Misremembered Left, on the current page 72, because we have an updated version coming out soon, we put it in writing. Because repressive tolerance, remember, Marcuse wrote a book in the 1960s called Repressive Tolerance. Because repressive tolerance encompasses all things American, a defense of America likewise axiomatically constitutes hate speech, or will at some point. It is not just that hate speech canons are un-American assaults on the First Amendment principles. It's that they are the antithetical negation of those principles positioned in a classic Hegelian process of negation. So privileges granted by the state will be negated by, privileges granted by the state, because the state is God, negates rights endowed by the Creator. Social justice, which is justice by socialist, negates justice. Rights of the migrant negate rights of the citizen. Interfaith, this is very important, interfaith negates faith. And the soft science of gender negates the hard and biological fact of sex. They all demand that 2 + 2 = 5 based on the scientism of imposed metaphysics. Gender is a metaphysic. Sex is a biological fact. When you put gender over sex, you are moving to the blue pill world that allows them to create blue pill mythologies on gender that have no basis in the biological fact of sex. Just think about that. They all demand 2 + 2 = 5. What? You think that's crazy? But here you have from Twitter just a couple months ago. I'm just looking for the date. Where's the date? I thought I put the date in here. August. All these teachers on Twitter talking how they're going to teach their students, your children, 2 + 2 = 5. And these are at the lower end of school, kindergarten, K through 6, K through 7, K through 8. So this is not theoretical. So I'd like to point out, we're talking about 2 + 2 = 5 and re-remembering the misremembered left. And we told you it would be imposed, and it is being imposed. See, right there, we said it, they're doing it. So with America as a repressively tolerant regime, Marcuse's repressive tolerance, with America as the repressively tolerant regime, wherever there is an other with a competing value, that value will be scored as holding a liberating, tolerant value that will then be pitted against an American value in the dialectical process of Aufheben. Let me stop. BLM uses intersectionality, and every attribute they create is the other that simply exists as a liberating, tolerant aspect, value that will be pitted against an American value for the process of dialectical negation, Aufheben. The dialectical process will use the other to generate as many liberating values as there are American values to be destroyed, with as many dialectical turns as it takes. Hence, because it is repressively tolerant to identify as an American, racism will negate this. Love America, xenophobia will negate this. Secure the border, the rights of migrants will negate this. Believe the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, fascism will negate this, as the dialectically determined living Constitution fully hollows out the meaning of the Constitution. As important, if American institutions of higher learning were built by immigrants of European stock, white privilege will negate this. If you are biologically male and call yourself a man, or female and call yourself a woman, genderism will negate this. They will criminalize it. You think this is kind of silly, but I just saw an article yesterday where some far left, and that's loony. You have to wonder whether they believe this, and the scary thing is, some do. And remember, they're the true believers, because the true Marxists understand all this does is destroy. And said, you're engaging in racism if you're white just by having a pet dog, because you've appropriated from Asia the taming of dogs, the domestication of dogs. Everything you value is to be negated, no matter how crazy it is. And here we have it, intersectionality. And I give you the definition of intersectionality, which is, I'm going to tell you, nonsense. If you go back, I kept telling you how big those books on intersectionality were. And that's part of the brief that goes into why that is so. It's a complex, cumulative way in which the effects of the multiple forms of discrimination, such as racism, sexism, and classism, combine and overlap. I would like to tell the reader, know that every time they see the word complex, that is a key term. It's complicated. It's complex. The world is so complicated, all we can do is manage chaos. When you hear somebody testify before Congress from the Department of Defense, the FBI, DHS, and their answer is complex or complicated, what they are saying is they're completely beholden to this narrative, which is a form of propaganda. It is an ideological attack. The complexity narrative is a Hegelian narrative that the Marxists use. And if you want to know how it works, just go to Appendix A of Re-Remembering the Misremembered Left. Bertrand Russell cracks the complexity code. And the simple answer is, you cannot solve the issue before you, can I call this a pen, until you solve the problems of the universe. Because you can't solve the problems of the universe, the problems of the whole, you can't even call this a pen. And therefore, everything, getting up out of bed is complex, so complicated, all you can do is manage chaos. And to the right, we see this graphic. This is the classic intersectionality graphic. Intersecting axes of privilege, domination, oppression. Now I'm going to show you a couple convoluted slides here, and then I'm going to go tell you how to translate them. So when they look confusing, I get it. And it's just to show the convolution behind what they're looking at, and to show you that this isn't science, it's pseudoscience. Okay, it is what we're going to call the science of reason. So you see that line of domination. And on the upper circle are and each axis is called something: genderism, sexism of anthropocentrism, racism, Eurocentrism, heterosexism, ableism, the whole gambit. And at the top is a characteristic of you, and at the bottom is its opposite that will be used to negate it. So white, people of color, female, male, male and female, male and masculine, female and feminine, gender deviant. And so what you see is this circle, and it's so scientific for people who use tarot cards, I guess. It's so scientific that you just have to yield to it, because they created this Gnostic language to explain it, so you think there's some deep meaning to it. But let's put it right alongside this praxis curve. And we're going to do that. But first, we're going to show how to break that circle, that intersecting axes of privileges. And what we're going to show is we'll separate the line of domination, and you have the stuff above the circle, which will be negated on those axes, and stuff below. Hence, the axis of educationalism uses non-literate to negate credentialed. I know that you're a rocket scientist and you could build a rocket to go to the moon, but your view on rocket science is no better than the guy who's a high school dropout, whose everything he says is based on his trips on his chronically on his drug addiction. See what I'm saying? Negation of your credentials. So that's what you see with that line of access. The line of domination is a line of negation. You see that on the right, the line of domination lines up with the period of praxis. It's also going to line up with the line of negation. So that's what they're doing, the educational access right there. I'll hold it for a second so you can just check it out. Credentialed, non-literate. Then listen to pronatalism, uses infertile to negate fertile. I mean, I want you to also think that this is just a little bit warped, okay? That you're actually talking to an infinitesimal part of the population that has a dominant control of the media and of education, and have completely penetrated through those educational lines into the people whose job it is to defend, support, and defend people who have positive views of America and who they are and their family. Do you see that's an attack on the family? See, fertile, infertile, pronatalism. I mean, that just make you quiver. You shouldn't say, gosh, there must be a real sign, natalism. I'm going to have to review this. And all you'll find is nonsense, masquerading of science. Why am I making this point so heavy? Scientism is one of the three main attack vectors of Marxism. Everything they do is masked as science. So you're stupid and uneducated and don't have to be respected because you're not buying into their scientific view. So here, our final example we're giving, of course, is racism uses dark to negate white. But once intersectionality is exposed as an instrument of negation, there is actually a better way of giving this presentation. And let me see something. Did I do something? Yeah. I want you to see that I took that line of domination and I positioned it over the line of negation, over those, after you have a series of negating events, it's just following the line of dominance equals the negation line in a period of a dialogue, a series of dialogues and a period of negation. And so I want to show it to you like that. Those axes, racism, Eurocentrism, I only use 7 because I didn't want to make this graphic too big. Eurocentrism, language bias, genderism, educationism, heterosexual, colorism. Here's how it really works. At the bottom are Americans who have an American identity. They know there are problems with America. They know there are problems with the church they go to or the synagogue they go to. They know there are things to improve. But you know what? America from the beginning has been dedicated to improving the lives of everybody and to making things better. Okay? And the goal of each of those little circles, with each one of them is a dialogue or a dialectical event, is to bring them up so that American identity is completely negated. So let's see how this works. You have racism is on the people of color, that's the axis, and it gets negated. Eurocentrism, non-European origin. Now remember, America was founded basically by refugees and immigrants from Europe, and they created the institutions. And really, this whole supremacy and privilege argument is basically saying we want to appropriate the institutions you created, which incidentally created the education allowed to rise all boats, created concepts of equality, created freedoms. Okay, we want to disappropriate you from the institutions you created, which are the very ones that create these concepts. But in the process of creating them, they totally destroy your identity, both culturally and personally. English as a second language, language bias. I want you to see as we move forward, all of a sudden, some of these things are being so effectively negated, they're fading out of existence. You see how that works? Now you see, white people of color has been called, I put this in random order because this is just to show how it works. What you see is that negation process goes and destroys everything. So I want to take a point here to talk about something. Observations on backdrop narratives. And of course, this is picking up from something that we brought up earlier, what are backdrop narratives. But let me just give it to you here, see if it still sinks in. The dialectic, including binaries and constructed personas, operate in the background and are often associated with the backdrop narratives of pseudo-real constructs. When you create a pseudo-reality, the matrix tells you that that's the blue pill universe. It's the matrix. But you could also say it's everything on the stage besides the main actors, okay? Including those personas that only exist on the side of the play to bring attention to the main characters. So binaries and personas. Binaries and personas are negative, simplistic, two-dimensional cliches that fix real ideals, real values, real beliefs, and goals in mocking cutouts for the purpose of subjecting those ideals, values, beliefs, and goals, as well as those holding them to intimidation, you must kneel, ridicule, this is racism. You're just a racist if you like America. Make it the object of thought-terminating cliches, and we'll get back to that, and to dehumanize these people. So these personas exist to actually dehumanize 65, 70% of the American population. And so we're revisiting that very slide we showed that DHS was saying when they said white supremacy is the most lethal threat to the US, DH draft assessment says. You see that when they're incorporating that language, They are incorporating this. That's what they're doing. But if everything above that line is about what you are supposed to support and defend, that means that what DHS is doing is putting their money on a narrative that's designed to do so at the expense of the support and defend mission they have. It's very serious. So, going to the matrix metaphor on this period of praxis paradigm, the red pill is everything outside that domain. It's real, it's reality, it's the unpseudo-reality. Political warfare personas are blue pill constructs associated with mass line enforcement narratives. They exist inside there. You see, the blue pill domain creates the blue pill action. Remember, this was where you have the period of violence. This is where white supremacy, white privilege, etc. exist. Racism, as Marxist mass line attack narratives, seek the destruction of the targeted majority population through negation. Racism, all of the civil rights movement, seeks to right injustices to shore equality of opportunity. Any discussion of racism that isn't in the red pill world is really a blue pill attack narrative. And what I'm trying to show you is, so long as you're fighting the white supremacist argument from within that narrative, you are completely captured in that blue pill domain. Remember, what did I say? The first thing you do on actions on receiving fire is break contact. So I'm going to skip by this. Well, I'll give it. I'll show you this. This is from a build we had earlier. The three legs of a dialectical attack, a Marxist attack, is the dialectic. What's this dialectic? Intersecting axes of privilege, domination, oppression. It is okay. What is the science of reason? Intersectionality, treating their concept like a science when it's not. It's a imposed metaphysic. And giving the state the authority to enforce it through peaceful protest narratives. Okay, why is that? Just a quick, the triadic attack of Marxism is based on three things: the dialectic that destroys everything, a ideology masked as science so they can not have any respect for people who disagree with them, and the fact that they hold that the state has godlike authority to enforce anything at once because it is godlike and that it commands complete obedience. So the intersectionality variant of Marxist dialect, this is the intersectionality is just a Marxist variation on dialectical attack. So again, this would make more sense if when you see the main brief of what's really happening, what's really being said here, all these attacks happen and there's clouds all over the place. So you don't even realize this three-legged attack is happening. You can't even articulate it because it's masked. It's hidden through a period, let me rephrase it, dialectical events, dialogues through a period of process, each one of which doesn't rise above the waterline. You don't see it, but this is what happens. And of course, we're going, these are wrap-up slides to the intersectionality. Intersection, you know, how do you combat this? Countering dialectical attacks, okay? For the attack, intersecting axes of privilege, domination, oppression, that's the dialectic. You need to ridicule it. Dude, that's just, you know, nonsense. Peaceful protest, how about the rule of law? How about saying, Mr. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, people who are authorizing intersectionality training in the FBI, the rule of law says that that is something that is completely contrary to your oath to support and defend the Constitution. How about intersectionality is just fake science? Fake science. So each counter can break down into a series of sub-counters. I use the rule of law versus peaceful protest for DOD as an example. The Constitution, the oath to support and defend, lawful orders, UCMJ. That's how you do that. But I want to show you something, and we're getting outside the thing here, but remember, we're saying that this is an overlay, and this is how the dialectical attack works using intersectionality, using a narrative build. But we see coming into phase here, what? The political warfare that overlays with this, the political warfare metric that makes this work. So you see that the narrative build that instantiates these narratives works perfectly with the political warfare aspect. And if you do it right, they hit at the end state where they're pushing into the end state to have these things succeed, and you're pushing back in that end state to keep it back. So this is just to show you that everything we're showing you lines up perfectly with political warfare, which we already showed you is in line with how you should understand insurgencies. So we're looking at this, and I show you here the book, Intersectionality, a Critical Social Theory, which is 376 pages, the paperback, which is 528 pages, and they're really big books. But they're really basically big books because they're using these pseudoscience, master science, and it really has to be wordy. And so this quote comes up a couple times before you see it in this brief. It's from Bertrand Russell, and this is what you need to know. Hegel's philosophy and every ideological view that comes from it, especially Marxism, especially critical theory, that's non-negotiable. Hegel's philosophy is so odd that one would not have expected him to be able to get sane men to accept it, but he did. He set out with so much obscurity that people thought it must be profound. 528 pages, 376 pages, and if you don't get it, you're not with the group if you don't pretend you get it. And of course, everybody pretends they get it, except for the people who know that all it does is destroy. It can easily be expounded lucidly in words of one syllable, but then its absurdity becomes obvious. Bertrand Russell explained Hegel that way in 1921, because all this is an Aufheben der Kultur, or, as is popular today, cancel culture. So I just explained in a few slides what is obscured in 528 pages. With those who are initiates, those who know what the real goal, know what's underneath the scientized language. All those initiate-laden scientized terms that make it imponderable for you to understand, but which the initiates truly understand. And this takes us all the way back to Schopenhauer's biting criticisms of Hegel, when he saw German minds and even other European minds glomming onto Hegel, just becoming mindless. In Germany, it was possible to proclaim as the greatest philosopher of all ages Hegel, a repulsive, mindless charlatan, an unparalleled scribbler of nonsense, wrote big, big, big books. Got it? You see the link? And for 20 years, many thousands have believed it stubbornly and firmly, indeed, even outside Germany. He lost in a book writing contest in I think, Denmark to somebody who was advancing Hegel. So he was just a little bitter. But Marxism, the scribblings of repulsive, mindless charlatans, unparalleled scribblers, the scribblings of repulsive, mindless charlatans, unparalleled scribblers of nonsense. Shouldn't you treat Marxism and these doctrines that come out of it that way? You have to know enough about the science they promote to understand it's ridiculous. You have to understand that you're meeting them halfway on the language of gender is you being in the blue pill world and are already beaten. And they're just keeping you there while that period of praxis has other dialectical events to hold you there while you get destroyed. So with that, I just want to wind up with something, a quote from Booker T. Washington that tells you that we're actually not seeing anything new here today. In fact, it sounds like a modern think tank. Now, I'm told I should read this because we're having on radio, but on page 118 of Booker T. Washington's book from 1911, My Larger Education, there is another class of colored people who make a business of keeping the troubles, the wrongs, and the hardships of the Negro race before the public. Having learned that they are able to make a living out of their troubles, they have grown into the settled habit of advertising their wrongs, partly because they want sympathy and partly because it pays. Some of these people do not want the Negro to lose his grievances because they do not want to lose their jobs. You turn the page. I'm afraid that there is a certain class of race problem solvers who don't want the patient to get well, because as long as the disease holds out, they have not only an easy means of making a living, but also an easy medium through which to make themselves prominent before the public. You know, it not really sounds like Black Lives Matter and Antifa. It sounds like half the think tanks in Washington, D.C. So I'll wrap up this Aufheben this intersectionality section by just kind of showing people the, the quote, the famous quote from George Orwell, to say this is exactly what's going on. You are being told to say 2 + 2 made 5, and you are obeying it. So with that, we're going to wrap up this first cut on the dialogue and praxis narratives to explain Marxism today in a political warfare context by giving you the meat up front. This is what's happening because they're doing this. And not only are we showing the tight fit of what you're seeing today, we're also proving that we said it 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago, and then said it was going to be exactly like this in November with Warning on Racism. So with that, we'll be back and we'll continue, and we'll bring up other aspects of how to understand Marxism so you could operationalize against it. With that, take care.